Well, I said we'd be covering it today, and this is basically how lowering these food standards is going to affect your health and the health of the UK in general. It's going to be terrible. Not only will it render UK farming completely uncompetitive in its own, country, because the UK farmers themselves are going to have to lower their standards, and that means they can't do trade with Europe. Because to trade with Europe, you have to meet their standards which we have now. And once again, I have to reiterate the fact that every time, even since the referendum, they've talked about how we can make our own regulations or we can do this divergence. Not one Brexiteer has actually come forward and said, these are the regulations we're going to get rid of. These are the new regulations we're going to bring in. But of course, they're not going to bring any new regulations because they're free market fundamentalists. And here's where we're going to diverge from the European standards. Not one Brexiteer has come forward and said what those are actually going to be. Why? Because Brexit is an ideological project. It doesn't have any policies, it doesn't have any actual concrete ideas other than this fantasy world that Brexiteers have conjured. And when fantasy meets reality, reality always wins. So, on to today's topic at hand. This comes from the Byline Times, and the article's called Fowl Play: How US Chicken Imports Will Pollute Britain's Poor. So, since joining the EU, British food has gone from bog-awful to top-notch. But Otto English reveals how the US trade deal will unravel 40 years of progress. Unless you were there, it's almost impossible to grasp quite how awful Britain's food was just 40 years ago. Back in the 70s, the British were decidedly and determinedly unsophisticated. The comparison with our continental neighbours was stark. I remember going on a trip to France as a child in the very early 80s and being presented with a weird green fruit called an avocado. What the hell was this strange item, and why would anyone eat such a thing? Couldn't they afford frozen Findus pancakes? Well, into the 1980s, most British people ate crap. Heinz sold coleslaw in tins. Anything that wasn't bland was off the menu. The majority of people didn't know how to cook or have the inclination to actually learn. The British had olive oil, but they kept it in the medicine cabinet in case their ears got waxy. Vegetables were boiled longer than the roast was cindered. Smash, an artificial potato powder, was a wonder food. If you fancy dessert, Mum would whip up some Angel Delight, which was neither angelic nor delightful. Meals that actually tasted of anything were viewed as the work of Satan. Many common products nowadays are taken for granted that just weren't available. Nobody knew what hummus was until the late 1980s, when Waitrose started selling it. Families rarely ate out, and if they did, it was at restaurant chains like Bernard Inn or the Golden Egg, which are fondly remembered now, but only because we've thankfully forgotten how awful the carbohydrated food actually was. Getting the British mindset to change was an uphill struggle. As of the late 1990s, Tesco was employing a Dudley Moore in a series of mildly racial adverts to introduce British audiences to the wonders of Italian food, introducing something utterly otherworldly called tiramisu. What a difference 3 decades makes. So since the 1990s, Britain has undergone a culinary revolution. The quality, variety, and the range of produce available to most British people today is better than at any time in history. Gastropubs dot the land. You can eat great and affordable menus out anywhere. Chefs have become celebrities. Bakery and cookery shows dominate the TV schedules. The British drink more wine and in greater variety than any of our European neighbours. And we've become a nation of foodies and connoisseurs. And it's all unbelievably affordable. Today, the average family spends about 10.6% of the family budget on food and drink, whereas in the 1960s it was 33%. The UK has come to enjoy some of the cheapest food in Europe. Our supermarket shelves are more plentiful than at any time, and the quality and variety on offer is second to none. In all of this, our membership of the EU played no small part. 30% of our food comes from our former partners, and an additional 11% arrives to through EU negotiated free trade agreements. While we are relatively self-sufficient in carrots and sprouts, we import a large proportion of practically everything else. 98% of the nation's oven chips, for example, come from the European Union. As a member of the EU, the UK also benefited from the highest standards of food hygiene and production anywhere in the world. By the way, Brazeteers, why is this a bad thing? I really want to know, because you're arguing against having really good hygiene and food production standards. How is that a bad thing? Anyway, we continue. Anywhere in the world, for when not plotting to subvert the colour of Nigel Farage's passport, those mandarins in Brussels were quietly enacting a revolution in the quality of even of our most basic produce. Take poultry. The average Briton eats an awful lot of chicken, consuming around 35 kilograms a year, or 2 portions a week, or an entire large broiler every month. 900 million chickens are bred and slaughtered every year, and a further 400 million are imported from the EU. Chicken farming is big business, and it is worth about 5 billion to the UK economy. That makes it 5 times bigger than the entire fishing sector, and it employs 3 times as many people. So why was nobody talking about this during the EU referendum? Well, because poultry isn't sexy. It doesn't tap into the ladybird librarian notions of a man pitted against haddock that so enamoured Farage to his chums. Poultry farming is brutal. It has to be, in order to provide the quality of meat, and the public crave it at a waver thin margins, and yet the standards imposed on the industry are second to none. It wasn't always this way, however. Back in 1997, the EU banned the practice of washing dead chickens in chlorine. This move was deeply unpopular with UK producers at the time, with one telling me everyone did it. Everyone worried about it being changed, but the mandarins wanted it to go ahead, and we had no other choice. So we demolished our old barns and spent millions building new ones to console ourselves that it would be alright because everyone was in the same boat. That last bit was crucial. While the UK retained its membership of the EU, the quality of our meat had to abide by EU standards wherever it came from. Since most of it was produced domestically, that meant that everyone had to do the same thing. Regulations pertaining to poultry were set out in Directive 2017/34/CE. They are incredibly rigorous. Barns must be built to very high spec. This means concrete floors, adequate light, food, water, minimum space per bird, and other proper ventilation systems in place. On-site vets are employed to check. On-site vets are employed to check on the welfare of the livestock and to ensure that disease or infection are kept at bay. Visitors are required to comply with the very highest hygiene standards and the rigorous cleaning process. Each batch of hens takes a week. As my industry contact put it, if hospitals were required to implement the standards of cleanliness we use, all those superbugs would be a thing of the past. In short, the boring old directive of 2007/43/CE means that chicken in your pie, curry, or sandwich has been bred to the most exacting standards anywhere in the world. By contrast to the EU, the US doesn't have any standards at all. In fact, it has none. Much has been made by the libertarian right of the fact that the chlorine in chlorinated chicken can't be tasted or that salad is washed in it, while ignoring the reason why many, but not all, American chickens are produced with this stuff. As European farmers have aimed to continually improve welfare, American producers have sought to increase their margins. US broilers spend their brief lives in cramped conditions on top of shit, mud, and carcasses of the chickens that die and thus never make it to the slaughterhouse. The chlorine is used to kill off the rampant infections, bacteria, and diseases that plague US poultry farms, but it's far from effective. Take salmonella. In the US, there are 1.2 million cases a year, 23,000 hospitalizations, and over 450 deaths. In the EU as a whole, which has a population almost 2 times larger than the US, there are approximately 1,766 hospitalizations due to salmonella and just 10 deaths. The US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention estimates that 1 in 6 American citizens suffers a foodborne illness annually. In the UK, that figure is 1. Kind of like that. So in America, 1 in 6 foodborne illness because there are no regulations. Currently, because we have really high food standards, thanks to the EU, in the UK, the figure is 1 in 132. Just to let you know what we're about to get into. Breakers Tears, why are getting rid of these standards a good thing? Boris Johnson is desperate for a trade deal with the US for no other reason than it will look like a victory. Donald Trump and his administration know that the UK is desperate. The US economy is 10 times bigger than ours, and with such disparity in size, there will be very little actual negotiation. The US farming sector is enormous, and a multi-billion-dollar poultry sector has been hungrily eyeing the UK's massive market for decades. The EU legislation has kept it out until now, but it sees its chance, and as such, chlorinated chicken now looks set to enter the UK. The Environmental Secretary, George Eustace, is already taking down the risks and not ruling out the meat heading this way. So who will that benefit? Well, in 2 words, American farming. Rolling back standards to import cheap meat will have a hugely detrimental impact on the UK poultry sector. The quality of produce in our food chain and presumably will put further strain on the US, on the NHS. It won't benefit the UK one tiny bit. A senior farming figure has told me that there will be no race to the bottom. You won't see UK farmers seeking to emulate it. So there is likely to become a 2-tier class of customers. Chlorinated chicken, some of it laden with bacteria, will become the food of the poor. It will be processed food and cheap takeaways. Still, it will make some big US corporations richer, so at least someone will be happy. And that's the truth. This is exactly what we've been warning you for years. The Brexiteer argument about getting rid of regulations. They can't exactly say why these regulations are good to get rid of, but here you have regulations they're getting rid of because they're so desperate to do a trade deal so it looks like a win for Brexit, which will, again, as we've gone over that many times, will do nothing to offset the loss we lose from leaving the single market. But there you go. Not only that, it will affect our health. As you've seen there, 1 in 6 Americans compared to 1 in 136 in the UK. So that's something we can expect, and that will again put pressure on the NHS. These regulations have a purpose and they are there for a reason. So please, Brexiteers, why is this such a good thing? Because everything we've seen and read here says otherwise.